YouTube, thank you so much for your love because right now we are 1300 subscribers. And having said that, have you ever considered how cool HTML form controls are? For instance, if you use date picker, time picker, range slider, how cool they are. And what if you could implement your own custom form controls and that too in Angular? I'm going to teach you exactly that in this video. I'm going to teach you how you can build custom form controls using the ControlValueAccessor API and how can you use that with template driven forms and reactive forms all together. If you have not subscribed to the channel, do it right now because you'll miss otherwise all the good content that's coming up in the coming weeks. So let's get started now. Alright, so right now what we have is a really cool demo in which I'll show you how our own component can be used as a form control. So we have this form which is basically for rating a particular service, let's say for an XYZ company, and it has two inputs. One is rating and the other is comment. You can see down below that we have the form details, and in the details we have either if the form is valid or not, and we also have the form's value which shows the values for both the inputs. So you can see that the value of the rating right now is 5. If I go here and try to change it, you can see that the value changes right away and it's reflecting in runtime. One more thing to consider is that since this is an input, I also have some validation around this. So the rating can be between 1 and 5. If I go above 5, you can see that it shows an error and the form submit is disabled. And you can also see that the form invalid right now is true because we have an error. Similarly, if I try to go to 0, you can see that we also have the error because the value should be between 1 and 5 and the form is invalid. And as soon as I have the correct value, the form invalid is false, and we have the values being shown here as well, and I'm able to submit this, which shows this on the console logs. So this is pretty much all we have. We also have the rating component that I'm going to use, so let's try to do that. So this is the source code. If I go to the source app components, this is the rating component that we will use, but so far what we have is basically the app component in which we are trying to use router outlet, and we have the home route. We have the only home route defined in the routes, and we have the home component shown as it is. Notice that we have the header, then we have the form, and then we have the container which shows the form details and such. So if I go to the rating component, you can see that the selector that we have is called app rating. So let's try to use this in the home component just besides the input for the rating. So if I try to open this, and if I go here at the input, I can just add app rating, and here we have it. Now let's save this and try this out. So now in the view, you can see that we have the rating component being shown. It has some functionality out of the box. For instance, you can see that it has a value already, which means 2 stars right now are being shown. You can also see the details of the rating component on the right side. This is what I've put to make you understand it easier on what is the value of rating and how it changes. So by default, the value of the rating component is 2. Now consider that right now it's not a form control, it's just a component, and this value is just a local property within the component itself. I'm going to show you that as well. And we also have some other properties. For instance, the value of a rating component right now is 2. But if I try to hover on, let's say, the 4th star, you can see that below the mouse over here is turned to true as soon as I hover. So we have a variable for that as well. And you can see that down below the hovered rating is 4. And this is necessary because we have to have two different states. One is the selected value and one is hover. Because if I try to, let's say, select the value 5 here, or let's say 4, and if I hover on 1, the others should be non-selected or non-highlighted. So that's why we have a separate variable for hovered rating. But that's all we have right there. So let's jump into the code and see some of the functionality. So if I go to rating component.ts, you will see that this is the value property that we have for the rating component. This is for the hovered rating, and this is for mouse over. Now in the HTML, you will see that we have some events bound to some browser events. For instance, we have mouse enter, mouse leave, and click. So on mouse enter, we try to just change the hovered rating value and we set the mouse over to true. When we leave a star, we basically turn this mouse over to false, and we also nullify the hovered rating. And when we select a star or when we click on a star, we set the value to the value of the star. And as you can see here, the value of each star is from 1 to 5. So if I'm clicking on the 5th star, this will basically pass 5 into select rating, and then that will be assigned to the value, and that's what we see on the UI as well. Now the question is, how do I use this as a form control? So if I go to home component, you can see that we are using the form group here, which is review form, and this is defined inside the home component. So in the home component, we have this review form, and then we have two form controls, comment and rating, and the default value of the rating is 5, which is set here. We also have some validators as well. And when we submit or click the button, then we just console log it. Now, you can see that here on the input, I'm using form control name rating, and I have to actually use this form control name with our component. So I'm not going to be using this one. So if I just comment this out, and if I try to put it here right now, let's see what happens on the browser. So here immediately you will see that we have an error, and it says no value accessor for form control with name rating found. And the reason behind this is that you cannot just use form control name attribute with any element. I mean, you can't use it with a div, you can't use it with a span, you can't use it with all of the HTML elements, but you can use it with checkbox, you can use it with input, you can use it with radio buttons and whatnot. The reason for that is that Angular behind the scenes has registered these elements already with the control value accessor, and we also have to tell Angular that this rating component is having a control value accessor. We'll go forward towards that later, but right now, first we have to implement the control value accessor interface. So let's do that. So now we are jumping into the first phase of converting this into a form control. In order to do that, I'm just going to implement the control value accessor interface. You basically import this from Angular forms, and then you can see that this class has become red, and that is because we have to implement some functions. There are 3 functions that we need to implement. The first one is register on change. The second one is register on touched. And the third one is write value. As soon as I've implemented this, you can see that this becomes okay. So now we can proceed forward. Now, there are some things that you need to understand for each of this function. All these functions provide us value from the Angular API, or we provide a value to Angular. So these are the APIs through which we communicate from this component to the Angular API and from the Angular API to this component. Now let's talk about register on change. We need a function that we can call whenever we change the value internally within this component. So whenever we set this value here, like on select rating, we need to tell Angular or the control value accessor that, hey, the value of this component has changed. Now reflect this into the form value. And in order to do so, we use a function that we get on register on change. So when we kind of define this, we get a function from Angular. So we can call this Angular provided function. This function is provided by Angular to us, and we need to declare a function ourselves as a placeholder, and we need to assign this Angular provided function to our function. So in order to do so, we say on change, and here we can define as any, and here we can simply say this. Similarly, we can define another function for touch. So we can say on touch, and here we can simply say any, and here we are defining this. Now just consider these as 2 variables which have been declared right now, but their actual values will come from here. So we can say this dot on change equals Angular provided function. Now Angular will provide a function to us, and we will set it to this dot on change. And when we change our component's value property internally, we also need to call this function on change with the new value. That's how Angular will know the value has changed, and it will reflect the value on the form. Now I'm just going to comment this for now, as we'll discuss this later with the actual example. Similarly, I'm going to get another function here which I'll call Angular provided function as well. And here I'm going to say this dot on touch equals Angular provided function. Similarly, we have the right value function, which provides us an Angular provided value, which is whenever the form's value or the form control's value changes outside of this component, we basically get that value here, and then we can show this on our UI of the component's UI. I'm going to leave it right here with just a console log. So we'll see this in the demo, how this works. Now, as we have defined these three functions, can we just use this as a form control right now? If I go back to the browser, let's see what happens. Nothing. It still has those errors. So what we need in order to tell Angular that this app rating is a form control is to define it into a provider. So let's do that. In order to do so, you will go into the component definition, and here you will use the providers array, and here you can define a provider. So I'm going to say provide ngValueAccessor, and I'm going to say multi-true, and then here we can say use existing, and then we can say forward ref, and we can say rating component. So what this is doing is that this is telling Angular that this rating component has a ngValueAccessor. And this is what Angular does behind the scenes for a lot of directives as well, such as input, checkbox, etc. So right now we are defining this so Angular knows about our component. If I refresh now, you can see that the error is gone, and now the rating component shows as well. So this is all that we needed to tell Angular that, hey, this component has a ControlValueAccessor. Now you can see that the rating component details shows the value 2, but the value of the form rating component is 5. So the form controls value is 5 that we set in the home component. Let me show you. So I'm talking about this home component's rating 5, this value here. So when our component initiates the rating component, its value should be 5 and 5 stars should be selected, right? But they don't. Why? If I go back to the browser, you see here is a log that says 5, and where it is coming from? It is coming from the rating component. So if I go here and show you, you can see it is coming from the right value function. So Angular itself is calling this function with the value 5. And why is it calling it with 5? If I refresh, you will see that this function is called by Angular, and I can start tracing it, but there's no point, as I can already tell you that this value 5 that you see is basically coming from the home component. It is coming exactly from here. So if I try to change this value to 4, let's see what happens when the app starts. So if I refresh now, you can see that the right value has the value 4. So it is basically coming from the place where we are defining the form group and the value for the form control. So as I said, whenever the value is changed or is assigned even outside of the component, Angular will provide us the value through this right value method. And here we need to now assign this value to this value property, so we can show the 4 stars highlighted in our component. So if I play right now, you will see that it still says 2 because the value we have hard-coded here is 2. Now let's set this and see this working. So I'm going to go to my rating component, and here in the right value, I'm going to remove this log, and then I'm going to assign this to this dot value here. And now if I save this and check this out, you can see that this value was 2, and now it's going to be 4, and you can see that 4 stars are now highlighted. So we have covered one way of communication, which is from Angular to our component. Now what happens if we try to change this value? So if I try to select 2 now, you can see that the rating component value is now 2, but the form value or the value of the form control is still 4. So how do we change this? In order to do this, as I said, we need to call this onChange function. So if I put a breakpoint here, and then if I put a breakpoint here, you will see that whenever we refresh, this right value was called with the value, Then we got this function from Angular. It is coming from forms.js. And we need to call this function whenever we update the value from our component, which means we have to put it here somewhere on select rating. So let's do that in the code. So I'm going to go in the code and just uncomment this and save this. And now we will go through. We got this, we got the function, we assigned the function. And now if I try to go and click the second star, you will see that it came into the select rating method with the value 2. We changed the value to 2 and you can see that it reflected. We have the second star highlighted and now we are calling this function on change with the value. And if I play, before playing, you can see that the forms value was rating 4. And if I play, you can see that the value is now 2. So we now communicated from the component to the form value and now they both are in sync. If I change the value outside, this will be reflected immediately in our component. And if I change the value from inside, it will be automatically changed to the form control value, but I have to call on change on that. I'm going to show you one more example real quick. So if I go to the home component and in the ng-on init, I can simply say set timeout. And here I can say this dot review form dot get, and here I can say rating dot set value, and then the value I set can be set to, let's say, 15. And then I'm going to call it after, let's say, 3 seconds. So let's save this and see what happens. So the value is 4 and now the value is 15. So we are changing the value in the home component outside the rating component and it is being reflected right away within the rating component. Now one last thing that we need to discuss is how do I disable this rating component, similar to how we disable different inputs. So first of all, I'm going to remove this. And then we are going to discuss how we use the disable property. So in order to do so, first I'm going to go here and then I'm going to just use an input. So this input will basically be used with the name of disabled. And by default, the value for this will be false. And now this rating component can be disabled. But what happens if the form control is disabled outside of the rating component, which means some other component is disabling it? Then we also need to make sure that we update this disabled property. And for that, we have a function from the ControlValueAccessor called setDisabledState. And in here, Angular provides us what is the value of the disabled property for the form control. So it's called Angular provided disabled val, super lengthy name. And then we can say this dot disabled equals Angular provided disabled val. And that's it. So we are going to just show the value of the disabled as well. So I'm going to go to home component and here we are going to add one more label. We're going to call this is disabled and here we are going to just use the disabled property. Now let's just save this and try this out. So here you can see that the disabled value is false. Let's try to disable it by passing the disabled parameter. So in the home component where I'm using the app rating, I'm going to pass the disabled property. So I can say disabled true and that's it. So let's see what the value right now is. So you can see that the disabled value is true as we are passing it. And now we have to make sure that when this is disabled, we cannot interact with the rating component. So let's do that. So I'm going to go to the rating component and here I can simply go and I can simply say, hey, if we have the disabled set to true, we don't do any of this magic. So we can simply say if this dot disabled return, and we are going to do the same for the rest of the stuff. So I can say this and then I can say this. Now let's save this and try this out. So here you can see that this is disabled and if I try to hover, you can see that nothing happens. If I try to click, you can see that the values are not changing. Okay, so this is working perfectly fine. Now let's discuss the case when the disabled of this form control is set by Angular somehow outside of the rating component. So I'm going to just remove this one from here. And here what we can do is that we can go to home component. We can use a set timeout here, let's say of 5000 milliseconds. And here I can say this dot review form dot get rating and then dot disable. And here, the form control should be disabled. So let's try this out now. So right now you can see that the is disabled is false. I've put a breakpoint here. And now you can see that this set disabled state is called biangular with the value true. And now we can assign this true to this disabled, and then we should be able to just block any interaction as well. And if we try to track down this from the call stack, you can see that it tracks back to the home component TS, where we are using the disable function, and then using the forms API, it finally calls the set disabled state of the rating component with the value of either if we have disabled or enabled this. And you can see that if I just remove this or deactivate this, and if I try to refresh, you can see that I can use it right now because it is not disabled. But now, since this is disabled, you can see that now I cannot interact with this. And that's all. So now you have actually learned the complete process of how we can use the ControlValueAccessor to use our own component as a form control anywhere. And you can see that in the home component, all I have to do is just use the form value, and I will get the latest value from the rating component. So if I just try to remove this, and if I go to browser, you can see that we have this value here, and whatever I change here, let's say if I set this to 2, and if I try to hit submit, you will see that on the console we'll get the value of the rating. Now this rating is a form control, and this can be used anywhere in the entire application at multiple places as well, and in fact in other applications as well if I just export this component. So instead of using inputs and outputs multiple times at multiple places, we have just converted this into a form control that we can use anywhere now. Alright, so I hope that you learned a lot in this video, and if you have not liked the video, do it right now. Share it with your friends so they also learn how they can create custom form controls. And if you have not subscribed to the channel, please do it, because I see that a lot of viewers that come to my channel have not subscribed. So if you subscribe the channel, that will help me. And if you like the video, that also helps the algorithm of YouTube to bring more content to other people. And I wish you happy coding till the next video. I'll see you then.